My name is Robert. I'm 34 years old, and on July 7th, 2018, I died for 8 minutes in a house fire. I was clinically dead with no heartbeat, no brain activity. The paramedics had given up on me. What happened in those 8 minutes changed me from a God-hating atheist to a believer. This is my story. I wasn't just non-religious. I actively hated the idea of God. When people would bow their heads to pray at family dinners, I'd sit there with my arms crossed, staring at them like they were talking to an imaginary friend. My own grandmother would ask me to say grace at Thanksgiving, and I'd tell her straight up that I don't talk to fictional characters. The hurt in her eyes never bothered me back then. I thought I was the smart one in the room. Growing up in Detroit, I watched my mother pray every single night for my father to come home sober. She'd kneel by her bed with her worn Bible, whispering prayers for our family, while we could hear him stumbling around downstairs, drunk again. She prayed when he lost job after job. She prayed when the bills piled up and the lights got shut off. She prayed when he finally left us when I was 12 and we never saw him again. Every unanswered prayer made me angrier. Where was this loving God when my mother cried herself to sleep? Where was he when we ate cereal for dinner? Because that's all we had. I watched my mother's faith never waver, even when we lost our house and had to move in with my aunt. She'd tell me God had a plan, that he was testing us. I'd look at her and think she was weak for believing in something that clearly didn't care about us. By the time I was in high school, I was that kid who'd start arguments about religion just to watch people squirm. I'd ask the youth pastor at my friend's church why children get cancer if God is so good. I'd challenge my history teacher when she mentioned anything about faith influencing historical events. I read every atheist book I could find, armed myself with arguments against every religious claim I encountered. In college, I majored in philosophy specifically so I could tear apart theological arguments. I wrote papers about the problem of evil, about how religion was just a crutch for people too weak to face reality. My professors loved my passion, even if they didn't always agree with my conclusions. I felt intellectually superior to anyone who believed in God. I thought faith was for people who couldn't handle the truth that life is meaningless and death is final. After college, I worked construction in Detroit. Hard, honest work that kept my hands busy and my mind focused on real, tangible things. Concrete and steel and wood. Things you could touch and measure and prove existed, not like the invisible sky daddy that people wasted their Sundays talking to. My co-workers would sometimes invite me to their churches or mention praying for me when I was going through tough times. I'd laugh right in their faces. I'd tell them to keep their prayers and use that energy to actually help someone instead of talking to the ceiling. When my buddy Marcus got married and asked me to be in his wedding, I told him I'd stand up there, but I wasn't bowing my head during any prayers. I stood with my eyes wide open during the entire ceremony, making sure everyone could see that I wasn't participating in what I considered a delusion. I had a reputation at work and in my neighborhood. I was the guy who would argue religion at barbecues and family gatherings. People stopped inviting me to certain events because they knew I'd make things uncomfortable. My aunt would have Christmas dinner and specifically ask me not to start any debates about religion because she wanted a peaceful meal. I'd agree, but then someone would say grace and I'd make a comment under my breath about talking to imaginary friends. Maybe some of you understand that anger I carried. It wasn't just indifference. It was active hostility toward the idea that there might be something bigger than what we can see and touch. I was angry at the concept of God, angry at the people who believed in him, and especially angry at the idea that I might need saving from anything. Every tragedy I saw on the news reinforced my beliefs. Natural disasters killing thousands of innocent people, children dying of diseases, wars fought in the name of religion. I'd point to these things and ask believers where their loving God was during all that suffering. When they'd give me answers about free will or God's mysterious plan, I'd roll my eyes and walk away, convinced that they were just making excuses for their imaginary friends' incompetence. I lived alone in a small house on Detroit's east side. No girlfriend who could tolerate my cynicism for very long. No close friends who shared my worldview, because most people, even non-religious ones, found my militant atheism exhausting. I preferred it that way. I thought I had life figured out in a way that most people were too scared to accept. My philosophy was simple. You're born, you struggle through a few decades, trying to pay bills and find some brief moments of pleasure, and then you die and rot in the ground. No afterlife, no judgment, no reunion with loved ones, just darkness and decay. I found this view liberating rather than depressing because it meant I didn't have to answer to anyone or worry about some cosmic scorekeeper tracking my moral failures. I thought I had escaped the weakness of faith. I believed I was living authentically by accepting the harsh reality that most people couldn't face. Every Sunday morning, when I'd hear church bells ringing in the distance, I'd feel sorry for all those people wasting their time singing songs to nobody. I thought I was strong for not needing the comfort of belief. I thought I was intelligent for seeing through what I considered humanity's oldest con game. I thought I was free from the guilt and shame that religion imposed on people. I thought I had life figured out. Work, pay, bills, die. That's it. No meaning beyond what you create for yourself. No purpose beyond survival, and maybe some fleeting happiness along the way. This was my truth, and I was proud of it. July 7th, 2018 started like any other Saturday. I'd finished a long week of construction work, laying foundation for a new apartment complex downtown. My hands were still sore from operating the jackhammer all week, and my back ached from hauling concrete blocks. I was looking forward to doing absolutely nothing except drinking beer and watching whatever was on television. It was one of those hot, muggy Detroit summers where the air feels thick enough to swim through. Even with my window air conditioning unit running constantly, my little house stayed stuffy and uncomfortable. I remember thinking about how much I hated summer in the city, how the heat made everything smell worse and made people more irritable than usual. I'd stopped at the corner store on my way home and picked up a 12-pack of cheap beer and some frozen pizza. Nothing fancy, just fuel to get through another weekend alone. I didn't have any plans beyond sitting in my recliner and maybe calling my cousin later to see if he wanted to watch the Tigers game. Simple pleasures for a simple man who didn't believe in anything beyond the physical world. When I got home around 6 in the evening, I tossed the beer in my old refrigerator and preheated the oven for the pizza. The kitchen in my house was tiny and outdated, with appliances that had seen better decades. The electric stove was older than I was, and the wiring throughout the house was something I'd been meaning to have checked, but kept putting off because I was too cheap to pay an electrician. I cracked open my first beer and settled into my chair to flip through channels. Nothing good was on, but that didn't matter. I was content to just zone out and let my mind go blank after a long week of physical labor. This was my routine, my sanctuary, from a world full of people who believed in things I considered foolish. Around 8 o'clock, I got up to put the pizza in the oven. I was already on my third beer and feeling relaxed for the first time all week. I slid the frozen pizza onto the middle rack and set the timer for 20 minutes. Then I grabbed another beer and went back to my chair, propping my feet up and settling in to wait for dinner. I must have dozed off in my chair, because the next thing I remember was the smell of something burning. At first, I thought I'd just left the pizza in too long, and it was getting crispy around the edges. I stumbled toward the kitchen, still groggy from my nap and the beer, expecting to pull out an overcooked pizza and eat it anyway. But when I got to the kitchen, I saw flames coming from behind the stove. The smell wasn't burnt pizza. It was the acrid stench of burning electrical components and melting plastic. Somehow, the old wiring behind the stove had overheated and caught fire. The flames were already spreading up the wall toward the ceiling. I thought I could handle it myself. I grabbed the fire extinguisher I kept under the sink and started spraying foam at the base of the flames. For a moment, it seemed like I was making progress. The flames died down, and I felt a surge of confidence that I'd caught the fire before it could spread. But I was wrong. Within minutes, the fire had found its way into the walls where I couldn't reach it. I could hear crackling and popping sounds from inside the walls as the flames spread through the old house like it was made of kindling. The smoke started getting thicker, and I realized I was in serious trouble. I ran to the phone to call the fire department, but the smoke was already so thick that I could barely see across the room. My eyes were burning and watering, and I started coughing uncontrollably. The heat was becoming unbearable, and I could see orange light flickering in my peripheral vision as the fire spread from room to room. I dropped the phone and headed for the front door, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. In my panic, I couldn't remember if I'd locked it from the inside, or if the heat had somehow warped the frame. I was starting to struggle for breath, and the smoke was getting so thick that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I got down on my hands and knees and started crawling toward what I hoped was the back door. The floor was getting hot beneath my palms, and I could feel the heat radiating through the walls around me. My lungs were filled with smoke, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. I was coughing so hard that I couldn't catch my breath between spasms. My vision was going dark around the edges, and I realized with growing terror that I wasn't going to make it out. This wasn't like in the movies where the hero makes a dramatic escape at the last second. This was real life, and real life was about to end for me in the most terrifying way imaginable. I remember crawling a few more feet before my arms gave out and I collapsed on the floor. My lungs were burning, and I couldn't get enough oxygen to keep my brain functioning. The heat was overwhelming, and I could hear the roar of flames all around me, consuming everything I owned. In those final moments of consciousness, my thoughts weren't about regret or fear of death. I remember thinking, with bitter irony, that this was exactly how it should end. No dramatic deathbed conversion, no crying out to God for help. Just a meaningless accident in a meaningless life, exactly like I'd always believed it would be. I thought about my mother's prayers all those years ago and how this proved I'd been right all along. There was no God watching over me, no divine plan, no meaning to any of it. I was just another animal dying in a fire, no different from any other creature whose life was ending randomly and brutally. My last conscious thought was a kind of satisfied vindication that I'd been right about everything. There was nothing after this, no judgment, no afterlife, no consciousness beyond the physical brain that was now shutting down from lack of oxygen. I was about to prove, once and for all, that death was simply the end of everything. Then, everything went black, and I thought that was the end of Robert's story. Complete darkness, just like I'd always believed it would be. The atheist had been proven right, and there was nothing left but the void I'd always known was waiting. But then I opened my eyes, and I wasn't in my burning house anymore. The first thing that hit me was the absence of pain. For those final moments in the fire, every part of my body had been screaming in agony. The smoke had felt like acid in my lungs. The heat had been searing my skin, and my head had been pounding from lack of oxygen. But now, there was nothing. No pain, no discomfort, no physical sensation at all, except a strange sense of lightness. I was standing, though I don't remember getting up. The ground beneath my feet felt solid, but somehow different from anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't concrete, or wood, or grass, but something that supported me perfectly, while feeling almost like I was floating. I looked down at myself and saw that I appeared to be in some kind of body, but it wasn't the same body I'd lived in for 34 years. The environment around me was unlike anything I could have imagined. There was light everywhere, but not like sunlight or artificial lighting. This light seemed to come from everything and nowhere at the same time. It didn't cast shadows or create glare, but somehow illuminated everything perfectly. The air, if you could call it air, was perfectly comfortable and seemed to carry a sense of peace that I'd never experienced. I kept trying to rationalize what was happening to me. My brain, trained by years of skepticism and scientific thinking, was working overtime to explain this experience in terms that made sense to my worldview. I told myself this had to be some kind of hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation. I'd read about near-death experiences and how the dying brain creates vivid hallucinations as it shuts down. But even as I tried to convince myself this was just my brain's final fireworks show, I couldn't ignore how real everything felt. I could think clearer than I ever had in life. My mind wasn't fuzzy or confused like you'd expect from a hallucination. Instead, my thoughts were sharp and focused, more coherent than they'd ever been when I was fully conscious and healthy. I started walking, though I'm not sure what compelled me to move in any particular direction. There didn't seem to be paths or landmarks to guide me, but something was drawing me forward. As I moved through this strange landscape, I became aware that I wasn't alone. There was a presence nearby, something I could sense, but not yet see. The feeling of that presence was the most unsettling part of the entire experience. It radiated something that my mind could only describe as love, but it was unlike any love I'd ever known. It wasn't the conditional love of family that comes with expectations and disappointments. It wasn't the romantic love that burns hot and fades. This was something pure and overwhelming, a love that seemed to know every part of me and accept all of it without reservation. That terrified me more than the fire had. I started backing away, saying out loud, "No, this isn't real. This is just my brain dying. This isn't happening." I was fighting against the reality of what I was experiencing because it contradicted everything I'd built my life around. If this was real, then I'd been wrong about everything. If there was consciousness after death, if there was something beyond the physical world, then my entire worldview was a lie. The presence kept getting stronger, and with it came an increasing sense of that unconditional love. It was like being wrapped in warmth that penetrated deeper than skin, deeper than bone, all the way into whatever part of me was experiencing this moment. But I didn't want to feel it. I'd spent my entire adult life armoring myself against the very possibility of this kind of experience. I remember thinking about all the religious people I'd mocked over the years, all the believers I'd dismissed as weak-minded and delusional. If this was real, then I'd been not just wrong, but cruelly wrong. I'd ridiculed people for believing in something that was actually true, while pridefully thinking my skepticism made me superior. The landscape around me seemed to shift slightly, becoming more defined without becoming more familiar. I could see what might have been distant mountains or hills, but they seemed to be made of light rather than rock. There were shapes that could have been trees, but they moved and swayed without any wind. Everything was beautiful in a way that made earthly beauty seem like a poor copy. But I didn't want to appreciate the beauty. I was still fighting, still trying to maintain my intellectual defenses against what was happening. I kept telling myself that this was all just neurochemistry, just the brain's way of easing the transition into death. I'd read about DMT and how it could create profound spiritual experiences. I convinced myself that this was just my brain flooding itself with chemicals to make dying less traumatic. Yet even as I tried to explain away the experience, I couldn't deny how real it felt. The clarity of my thoughts, the vividness of my surroundings, the intensity of the emotions I was feeling, all of it was more real than anything I'd ever experienced while living. This wasn't like a dream where things are hazy and disconnected. This was hyper-real, more substantial than physical reality had ever been. Ask yourself, how would you react if everything you believed about life and death was suddenly proven wrong? What would you do if you discovered that the foundation of your entire worldview was built on false assumptions? That's the position I found myself in, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to reject what was happening. I felt love before I saw love, and that love was approaching whether I wanted it to or not. The presence was getting closer, and with each step it took toward me, my carefully constructed atheism was crumbling. I could feel the walls I'd built around my heart starting to crack, and I was terrified of what would happen if they fell completely. The man who had died in that fire was a proud atheist who thought he knew everything about reality. But the consciousness that was standing in this place of light was beginning to realize that he'd known nothing at all. The presence I'd been sensing finally took form, and when I saw him, I knew immediately who it was, even though he didn't look anything like the paintings I'd seen in churches or the images I'd mocked my entire life. Jesus stood before me, and his appearance was both completely human and utterly divine. His skin was darker than the pale European depictions I was familiar with, more like what a first-century Jewish carpenter would actually look like. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They held a depth that seemed to contain all of history, all of eternity, and when he looked at me, I felt like he was seeing every moment of my life simultaneously. Those eyes knew everything about me, every angry word I'd spoken against him, every time I'd mocked believers, every moment I'd pridefully declared his non-existence. He knew about my childhood rage when my prayers went unanswered, my teenage rebellion against anything sacred, my adult militancy against faith. He saw all of it, and yet there was no anger in his gaze, no condemnation, only a love so pure it made my chest ache. I actually tried to argue with Jesus. Even faced with undeniable proof of his existence, my pride kicked in, and I started defending my atheism. I told him that if he was real, he'd done a terrible job of making himself known. I accused him of hiding while children suffered and innocent people died. I demanded to know where he'd been when my mother prayed desperately for our family and got nothing but silence. His response completely disarmed me. He didn't defend himself or justify his actions. Instead, he said gently, "I know you're angry at me, Robert. Tell me why." His voice was like nothing I'd ever heard, carrying both infinite authority and infinite compassion. It invited honesty rather than demanding submission. So I let it all out. 34 years of rage and hurt came pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. I told him about watching my mother's faith get crushed by unanswered prayers. I told him about all the suffering I'd seen in the world and how it proved to me that either he didn't exist or he didn't care. I accused him of being absent when people needed him most, of letting evil flourish while good people suffered. As I spoke, I realized I was crying, though I hadn't cried, since I was a child. The tears felt different here, not like the physical tears I remembered, but something deeper. I was finally expressing pain I'd been carrying for decades, wounds I'd covered with anger and intellectual pride rather than allowing them to heal. Jesus listened to every word without interruption, and when I finally ran out of accusations, he began showing me moments from my life, but from a completely different perspective. I saw my mother praying for our family, and suddenly I could see Jesus there, with her in those moments, weeping alongside her, sharing her pain. I could see how her prayers weren't unanswered, but were being answered in ways I'd been too blind and too angry to recognize. He showed me the times when things could have been much worse, but weren't. The people who came into our lives at just the right moments. The opportunities that appeared when we needed them most. I'd always attributed these things to luck or coincidence, but now I could see the gentle hand of Providence working behind the scenes, respecting our free will while still caring for us. But the most devastating revelation was when he showed me how my pain had turned into a wall that kept out not just faith, but love itself. I saw how my anger had poisoned my relationships, how my pride had isolated me from the very connections that could have brought healing. I'd been so determined to prove that God didn't exist that I'd missed all the ways he was trying to reach me through other people. He showed me moments when friends had tried to show me kindness, and I'd rejected it as weakness. Times when family members had expressed love, and I'd dismissed it as sentiment. Opportunities for connection and community that I'd turned away from because I was too proud to admit I needed anything from anyone. The most painful part was seeing how my militant atheism had hurt other people. I watched scenes of myself mocking believers, tearing down their faith with my sharp tongue and intellectual arguments. I saw the pain in their faces when I ridiculed something sacred to them. I witnessed how my words had planted seeds of doubt in some people's hearts, weakening their connection to something that brought them peace and purpose. Jesus helped me understand that my anger wasn't really about theological arguments or intellectual honesty. It was about a little boy whose father abandoned him, whose prayers for his family went unanswered in the way he expected. My atheism was really just hurt wearing a disguise of intellectual superiority. He showed me how my pain was completely understandable and how he'd never condemned me for my anger, even when I'd condemned him. Every moment I'd spent raging against his existence, he'd been loving me, waiting patiently for me to exhaust my fury and allow him to heal the wounds underneath it. The exact moment my heart changed was when I finally stopped fighting and just let myself feel his love. It was like every defense I'd built up over the years simply melted away, leaving me completely vulnerable, but somehow safer than I'd ever been. The love I felt was so overwhelming, so complete, that it made every other good feeling I'd ever experienced pale in comparison. I'm telling you this as someone who fought God my whole life, who built an identity around rejecting him, who took pride in my intellectual resistance to faith. His love broke through every wall I'd built, dissolved every argument I'd constructed, and healed wounds I didn't even know I was carrying. In that moment, I understood that I'd been wrong about everything. Not just wrong about whether God existed, but wrong about what kind of God he was. I'd imagined him as distant, judgmental, capricious. But the Jesus standing before me was none of those things. He was pure love, infinite compassion, and perfect understanding. I fell to my knees, not because I was commanded to, but because my legs couldn't support me under the weight of this revelation. Everything I thought I knew about reality had been turned upside down, and I was finally ready to surrender my pride and accept the truth I'd spent my entire life running from. After what felt like an eternity of experiencing this perfect love, Jesus gently explained that I had to go back. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't a request or a command, but simply a statement of fact about what needed to happen next. "Your story isn't finished, Robert," he told me with that same voice that carried both tenderness and absolute authority. "There are others who need to hear what you've experienced here. People who are where you were, carrying the same anger and pain that brought you to this place." I didn't want to go back. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely at peace, completely loved, completely whole. The idea of returning to my physical body, to the world of pain and confusion and struggle, felt like being asked to leave paradise for prison. I'd spent 34 years feeling angry and isolated, and now I was being asked to give up this perfect communion to return to that broken existence. But even as I resisted the idea, I understood why it was necessary. The man who had died in that fire was a bitter atheist who could never have believed what I was experiencing. But the man who would come back would be living proof that God's love could reach anyone, no matter how far they'd fallen or how hard they'd fought against him. Jesus helped me understand that my experience wasn't just for me. It was meant to be shared with others who were trapped in the same cycle of pain and anger that had defined my life. People who had given up on God because their prayers seemed unanswered. who had built walls around their hearts to protect themselves from further disappointment, who wore their skepticism like armor against a world that had hurt them. The transition back to physical reality was jarring beyond description. One moment I was standing in that place of perfect light and love, and the next I was gasping for breath in my burning house, surrounded by paramedics who were working frantically to revive me. The contrast was so stark that for a moment I thought the experience with Jesus had been the hallucination, and this hellish scene was reality. My first breath back in my body was agony. My lungs felt like they were full of acid. My throat was raw from smoke inhalation, and every nerve ending seemed to be screaming in protest. The peace I'd felt in that other realm was replaced by intense physical pain that made me want to cry out, but I could barely manage a whisper. I could hear one of the paramedics saying, "We've got a pulse. He's back." Another voice was calling out vital signs and medical terminology I didn't understand. Someone was putting an oxygen mask over my face, and the cool flow of clean air into my damaged lungs was both relief and torture at the same time. As they loaded me onto a stretcher and carried me out of my destroyed house, I caught a glimpse of the devastation. The entire structure was engulfed in flames, and I realized that by any rational measure, I should have died in there. The paramedics were calling it a miracle that they'd found me alive, but I knew the truth. I'd actually died, and Jesus had sent me back. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, I tried to process what had happened to me. The paramedics were amazed that I was conscious and coherent. They kept asking me questions about pain levels and symptoms, but I was struggling to find words for what I was experiencing. How do you explain to medical professionals that you've just had a conversation with Jesus Christ? The emergency room was chaos. Doctors and nurses were running tests, checking my vitals, treating me for severe smoke inhalation and burns. They kept saying how lucky I was to be alive, how rare it was for someone to survive that level of smoke exposure. One doctor told me that based on the condition of the house when they found me, I should have been dead. But the most remarkable thing was what the tests revealed. Despite being found unconscious in a house fire with no detectable pulse or breathing, my brain showed no signs of oxygen deprivation. My lungs, while damaged from smoke inhalation, had recovered far more quickly than anyone expected. The burns on my skin were surprisingly minimal, given how long I'd been exposed to the heat and flames. Everyone called it a miracle, but I knew the truth went far beyond what they could measure with their instruments. The hardest part was trying to explain what had happened to me. When the doctors asked about my experience while unconscious, I started to tell them about meeting Jesus. But I could see the looks they exchanged. They were concerned about possible brain damage, hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation, psychological trauma from the near-death experience. How do you tell people you met Jesus when you'd spent years mocking him? How do you explain a complete transformation of your worldview to people who knew you as the neighborhood atheist? My own brother, when he came to visit me in the hospital, thought the smoke damage had affected my brain when I tried to tell him what really happened. The medical staff kept me for observation for several days, running more tests and monitoring my recovery. During that time, I had plenty of opportunity to doubt what I'd experienced. The rational part of my mind, trained by years of skepticism, kept trying to find scientific explanations for what had happened. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. Maybe it was my brain's way of coping with trauma. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But every time I started to doubt, I could still feel the echo of that perfect love I'd experienced. It wasn't like a memory that fades over time. It was like a presence that had taken up residence in my heart, a warmth that no amount of rational analysis could diminish. The man who had entered that burning house was angry, bitter, and certain that death was the end of everything. The man lying in that hospital bed was fundamentally different. I still looked the same on the outside, but everything inside had been transformed by 8 minutes in the presence of perfect love. When I was finally released from the hospital, I faced the challenge of living as a completely different person in the same world I'd inhabited before. The physical Robert looked the same, but everything else about me had been transformed by those 8 minutes with Jesus. I had to learn how to live as a believer in a life I'd built as an atheist. The first thing I did was get down on my knees in my temporary apartment and pray. It felt awkward at first because I'd spent decades mocking the very act of prayer, but I talked to Jesus like he was sitting right next to me, which is exactly how it felt. I thanked him for saving my life, for showing me the truth, and for loving me despite all the years I'd spent fighting against him. I started reading the Bible, something I'd only done before to find ammunition for arguments against Christianity. Now, I was reading it as someone who had actually met the author of salvation, and every word carried new meaning. Stories I'd once dismissed as mythology now felt like personal messages. Verses about God's love and forgiveness brought tears to my eyes as I remembered the overwhelming compassion I'd experienced in his presence. Finding a church was intimidating because I'd spent years being the guy who argued with religious people at every opportunity. I was afraid that people would remember my hostility and not believe that my conversion was genuine. But I knew I needed to be around other believers, to learn how to live this new faith in community with people who could help me grow. I chose a small Baptist church not far from where I was staying. The first Sunday I walked through those doors, I felt like everyone was staring at me, though they probably weren't. During the worship service, when everyone stood to sing praise songs, I found myself crying. The music that I'd once considered empty noise now seemed to echo the love I'd experienced with Jesus. After the service, I approached Pastor Williams, a kind older man who had been leading this congregation for over 20 years. I told him I needed to speak with him privately, and when we sat down in his office, I shared my story. I expected skepticism, questions about my mental state, maybe even rejection. Instead, he listened with tears in his eyes and welcomed me with open arms. The hardest part was rebuilding relationships that my atheism had damaged over the years. I had to apologize to a lot of people for the hurtful things I'd said about their faith. Some forgave me immediately, understanding that my anger had come from pain rather than malice. Others were more cautious, needing to see evidence that my transformation was real and lasting. My brother Marcus was the most difficult to convince. He'd heard me mock religion for years, had endured my arguments at family gatherings, had watched me drive away anyone who tried to share their faith with me. When I told him about meeting Jesus, he was convinced the fire had damaged my brain. He actually insisted I see a neurologist to rule out any trauma-related psychological changes. The tests came back normal, showing no sign of brain damage or psychological disorder. But Marcus still couldn't accept that his militantly atheist brother had become a born-again Christian. It took months of demonstrating genuine change in my character and behavior before he began to believe that something real had happened to me. My co-workers at the construction site were equally skeptical. These were tough, practical men who knew me as someone who would mock anyone who mentioned God or church. When I started declining invitations to bars and strip clubs, when I stopped cursing and started treating people with obvious kindness, they thought I was going through some kind of midlife crisis. But gradually, they began to see that the changes were real and permanent. I approached my work with a new attitude, treating my job as a way to serve others rather than just collect a paycheck. I started volunteering to help coworkers with personal projects, offering support during difficult times, and generally becoming the kind of person I'd never been before. People want scientific proof when you tell them about an experience like mine, but some things can only be felt in your heart. I can't take you to a laboratory and reproduce what happened to me during those 8 minutes. I can't provide physical evidence of my conversation with Jesus or measurements of the love I experienced. All I can offer is the testimony of a life transformed and the witness of people who knew me before and after. Living with this experience means dealing with ongoing challenges. There are days when doubt creeps in, when the rational part of my mind tries to convince me that I imagined the whole thing. During those times, I have to rely on faith rather than feelings, trusting in what I know to be true, even when I can't feel the presence of God as strongly as I did in that place of light. I've also had to learn patience with skeptics, because I used to be one myself. When people challenge my story or question my sanity, I try to remember that I would have reacted the same way before my experience. I don't argue or try to convince anyone through debate. Instead, I focus on living in a way that demonstrates the reality of God's transforming love. Every day, I wake up grateful for a second chance I didn't deserve. The old Robert died in that fire, consumed by anger and pride, and the emptiness of a life without faith. The man who came back is living proof of what God's love can do when we finally stop fighting it and allow it to change us from the inside out. My mission now is to share this story with people who are where I used to be. People who are angry at God, who feel abandoned by Him, who have built walls around their hearts to protect themselves from further disappointment. I want them to know that no one is beyond the reach of His love, no matter how far they've fallen or how hard they fought against Him. So I'm asking you, just as someone who's been where you might be now, to consider the possibility that everything you believe about God might be wrong. Not wrong because you're stupid or weak, but wrong because you've been looking at Him through the lens of your pain rather than through the truth of His character. Look inside your own heart right now. What is it telling you? Beneath all the arguments and intellectual defenses, beneath all the hurt and anger and disappointment, is there a part of you that longs for the kind of love I experienced? Is there a corner of your soul that hopes there might be more to this life than what we can see and measure and prove? I can't prove what happened to me, but I'm living proof of what God's love can do. If an angry, God-hating man like me can be changed, anyone can be changed. The same Jesus who found me in that place beyond death is waiting for you right now, ready to heal your wounds and transform your life in ways you never thought possible. Don't wait until you're dying in a fire to discover what I discovered. Jesus is real. His love is real, and He's waiting for you to stop running and come home.